Accessing library computer data.
Out there are no saints. Just people.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. We're continuing our run through Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Right now we're up to the episode called Starship Down, the 7th episode of the 4th season. It aired on November 6, 1995, written by David Mack and John J. Ordover. David Mack is famous as being a Star Trek, not fan fiction, but a Star Trek book writer. It's directed by Alexander Singer. In this episode, Sisko defends a Karema ship when it is attacked by the Jem'Hadar. Meanwhile, Quark and the Karema trade minister argue about the value of dishonesty in trading before having to work together to disarm a Jem'Hadar torpedo. We're joined by Iona for this one. Iona, how are you? Nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too, Wes.
Yeah, thanks very much for agreeing to come on the show. We were introduced by a mutual person on Twitter. Do you want to introduce yourself and how you came to Star Trek and what you sort of do in real life outside of that?
So I'm a writer and editor, and I live in India, in Bombay. And I started watching Star Trek with Next Generation back in the late 80s. And I've watched Deep Space Nine, I think, 3 times now. I'm on my 4th watching. And I first watched Deep Space Nine during a time when I was very, very depressed. And I think it's one of the things that sort of kept me going was watching multiple Deep Space Nine episodes, drinking gin and tonics and eating more Bombay mix than any human being should ever eat.
Yeah, it's so you're an expert, I guess, is the way to say. You're more of an expert than I am at Deep Space Nine at this point too. So it'll be interesting to talk about. I would assume that just knowing from what you write for and your sort of views on things, would you say that DS9 is your favorite of the Star Trek series?
Absolutely, yes. I do have a very poor memory, though, which is kind of a blessing when it comes to Star Trek, because it means that I enjoy rewatchings, probably more than I would otherwise.
Yeah, it's the benefit of forgetfulness, is you can enjoy everything over and over again.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, I'm going to take a break. We're going to play an audio clip. Me and Iona are going to come back, and we're going to break down the episode that is called Starship Down.
The Jem'Hadar are powering up their weapon systems. They are targeting the Karema ship.
They're here to punish us for meeting with you. If I give myself up and assume full responsibility, they may spare my ship.
I'm not about to turn you over to them. Open a channel. This is Captain Benjamin Sisko of the USS Defiant. Stand down, or we'll be forced to return fire.
The Karma ship is coming about. They're moving away, Captain.
Tell your people to hold position. We can't protect them if they run.
The Karma aren't responding to our hails.
The Jem'Hadar are changing course. They're going after the Karema ship. Move to intercept.
All right, so getting into this one. It's a disaster episode. Star Trek tends to like doing disaster episodes. They don't do it quite as much as you would think based on the premise of the series and everything, but they do enjoy a good disaster episode where the ship is compromised and people have to work together. I'd say that this one is actually a combination of Balance of Terror from the original series and Disaster from TNG, which is probably the sort of the prime example of a disaster episode. It's an episode of the show that has been a little bit odd in its placement in the 4th season, but I think that it's a interesting idea. My main criticism, the way this usually works, Iona, is just kind of a general take at the top, but I'll throw it to you by just asking that, or saying, this is written by David Mack and John Ordover, who are known as Star Trek fiction writers, who never really worked as writers on the show, but they are fairly prolific as book writers for the Star Trek series. And without insulting them, because this is a TV process where the room obviously rewrote their script, the writer's room of the show, this episode feels to me like it's a little bit of a fan fiction episode. It feels like it was born of an idea, and the rough draft skeleton came from a fanish interpretation of what the show would be. Do you have any thoughts about the episode in general, or do you want to just bounce off of that point?
I'm not sure what you mean by fanish interpretation, but I can say a few things about how I feel about the episode. Interestingly, when you asked me which episode I wanted, and out of the ones that were still unclaimed, this was the one I chose. I had a much rosier memory of it than I felt much more enthusiastic about it in retrospect than I did rewatching it and trying to analyze it for this podcast. And I think that is because it's because of something fundamental for me to Deep Space Nine, which is that Deep Space Nine is very much based on personal relationships. Or personal relationships play a much larger role in DS9 than I think they do in either Next Generation or Voyager, for example. And Voyager is a wonderful show as far as the premise goes. I love the situations in Voyager. I enjoy the explorations of the Delta Quadrant. I like the different species they come across. I find the idea of Voyager in many ways more exciting as an adventure show. And I love many of the individual episodes, but Deep Space Nine is a far more sophisticated and engaging show in a literary sense. And that's because what's important in DS9 is not so much how interesting individual characters are as their relationships, that almost all the relationships in Voyager fall rather flat. The only one that has real tension is Janeway's relationship with Seven of Nine, whereas in Deep Space Nine, almost all of the individual couplings are fascinating because of the kinds of trajectories they go through and the mixture between attraction and conflict that we see happening with pairs of characters. And this episode is very much based on little vignettes of paired characters trying to work things through together. And a lot of that has to do with the relationships between those characters, and that's quite specifically thematized in that episode. So I think that's why I held this episode in such fond memory in its context of DS9 as a whole. Whereas when I look at it as a separate work, I'm not as impressed by it as I thought I was going to be.
Yeah, I agree that the episode is actually the weakest of the season, I think, so far. So I was interested that you had chosen it. It sounds like it was a little bit of faulty memory coming through, which happens with all these Star Trek episodes. But it's an episode of the show that I called fanish in the sense that I have a sense of fan fiction. If you're not aware, fan fiction is sort of tie-in fiction written by fans of the series, and it's not canon, but it's sort of fans having fun with it. And fan fiction has a problem where if people are not particularly great writers and they start writing something, they tend to have a skewed version of what they think the characters should act like. And you sort of see it in that nothing feels actually real to the show. Like it feels like someone else who's not particularly familiar with how to write the show came in and wrote the episode for you. This one feels a little fanish in that sense because, as you were saying, well, it's all character vignette based. I don't feel like they actually get the characters right in any of the sequences. They all feel a little bit off of what the show has previously shown us between them. The biggest example, I think, is Kira's characterization here, which feels far too religious and deferential to Sisko in a way that I'm not sure the show has ever sold us before. That would be my take of it. Everything felt a little bit off. I was just wondering what you thought about that. If you thought that was the main reason for the weakness, or you had some other reason to think that it wasn't as strong as you remembered.
Actually, no. I mean, I felt that. So, taking the relationships one at a time, let's start with Kira and Sisko part. I felt that it was a little bit repetitious, and in particular, I Bajoran folklore is so boring.
It is.
How did they manage to evolve such a sophisticated culture and have such utterly boring folklore and literature? Actually, I think this is a recurring problem in Star Trek, that also Cardassian literature is terrible, and so I gather is Klingon literature and Vulcan literature. There must have been some more interesting creative people from these different species. Humans can't be surely the only ones who can write good fiction, the sort of fiction within the fiction. But I felt that Nana Visitor's acting in that episode was superb, personally, looking back at it. And I also feel as though that clearly is an element of Sisko and Kira's relationship. And so I didn't find it so unbelievable, especially under the kind of conditions of her nursing Sisko through this concussion and the emotionally heightened moment. I found it quite believable, her attitude. I just felt the dialogue lacked a little wit and sparkle, and it was a bit tedious, both the story and the praying. But I was quite convinced by Kira's attitude here.
I find that Kira, what happened? Well, first of all, you're right about the Bajorans. The Bajorans are tremendously boring for being such a focal point of the show. They never really bothered to flesh out what the Bajoran religion is all about. They just use vague terms like prophets and prophecies and prayers and things. They never really get specific with them. It's a big problem. And Kira, in general, I think, even outside of this episode leading into it, is very inconsistent with what she feels about the religion. She's obviously pious in a way that all the Bajorans are, but she also seems like she's a little bit more of an outsider to the religion than a lot of the more conservative Bajorans are. And
I'm not sure about that. So remember the episode, I don't remember the name, but you remember the episode when when
Opaka.
Wynn, she's not Kai then at that stage.
Oh, sure.
Comes to the station and interferes with Keiko O'Brien's school because she wants them to teach. She wants Keiko to teach about the Celestial Temple and the prophets rather than the wormhole and the wormhole aliens. So she wants to religiously censor Keiko's science class. And Dak says, in a sort of appalled way, that it's surprising how many people she has on her side, Wynn has on her side, when she is clearly a religious fanatic. And Kira says she has me on her side. She's got my support.
Well, Kira is, just by the nature of what Kira is that she has to be put into this spot of being a Bajoran believer who has sort of been, one of the themes of Star Trek is that once you're put into Starfleet and the Federation, the values of the Federation will overtake whatever values you previously had. Kind of is that's the sort of watering down, and Garrick and Quark have mentioned that in previous episodes. The thing about Kira is that because she's always played against more conservative Bajoran. She's played against the Vedics, and she's played against the Kais, and she's played against sort of true believers who come to the station looking for one prophecy or another. And Kira's been a little bit shown the other side of the coin just by nature of having been on the show for so long. And so I think the inconsistency I see in Kira is that when it's a Bajoran episode where her faith has to be examined, her faith is immediately up front with everything. There's not a lot of nuance to it. In other episodes that don't deal with Bajoran faith, it's very sidelined. She's never very concerned about things until a Vedic appears on the episode, until there's a prophecy that she has to deal with. And I feel it's a little bit inconsistent just because she feels like she has a little bit of a split personality that doesn't translate between those kind of focused episodes. So I feel like she should have lines that are more Bajoran driven in non-Bajoran episodes, and that would make me feel that she's more of a whole. But in this case, I just feel that her her problem with Sisko seems to come on so strongly that I'm surprised that they'd never really hinted at it before. I would have appreciated a little bit of a more subtle buildup. I think they're limited by the fact that she's one of 4 stories in the episode, and they don't have a lot of time to build on it. I think it's a story that would have been better if it was focused entirely on their relationship, because to me, it's just the problem. It comes down to the structure, which I think all the stories have, is that because there are so many stories going on in here and they're all character based, they don't have a lot of time to really delve into it, and they come across as kind of half-assed by the end of it.
I mean, I don't feel that there's a contradiction. Well, there is a contradiction, but I feel it's a very human and normal contradiction between Kira's role as, she's not officially part of the Federation. She's not part of Starfleet, but her role within that sort of military system, and also her beliefs. And that's partly because just to get a little bit autobiographical here, I know a lot of Zoroastrian reformers. So I'm a Parsi, a Zoroastrian, who are extremely liberal and humanist in their outlook, but are very devout. So that's a combination I'm very used to seeing, and which might be a little jarring if you're not accustomed to this, but I think it's quite a common way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Would you...
It's that...
Oh, go ahead.
Yes, go on, yes.
Well, it's just Kira being fleshed out that way as a dual personality sounds wrong, but it's sort of being a complicated character who has conflicting beliefs about everything is something that would work for me. It's just the fact, I think, that the Bajoran religion is so bland and vague that whenever it comes up with these kind of crisis of faith that Kira would have, it never really seems to stick for me. And I wish that they had explored this more. I think that the Sisko and Kira relationship actually makes a lot of sense in this episode. It just sort of comes out of nowhere to me. And I wish that they had built off of it, and I wish that they had explored it further. All the way down to the ending where they decide that they want to play baseball with each other and hang out and stuff like that. Not being able to see Sisko's point of view of this is equally frustrating, because we've been told a lot about Sisko's point of view of being the emissary, but we haven't really seen him in action. You get a lot of cutscenes of people telling you that, Sisko avoided this ceremony because he's uncomfortable. To my memory, Sisko has never commented on the emissary role in a way. It's always done this very secondhand way, and I think that that's kind of frustrating.
Yes, I think certainly up to this point in the series. I think he does comment on it later. And if I were him, I would feel extraordinarily awkward. I think too awkward to comment. So I give the writers a little bit of benefit of the doubt about that. Although why there is not some snippet of conversation with Dax, for example, about his feelings, that I don't quite understand. But I can see why he avoids this topic with Kira.
What is your understanding at this point in the series of what the emissary is supposed to be? Because to me, they describe the emissary role so vaguely again that I'm not sure the writers really want to take a stab at what it means to be the emissary. They're sort of scared of going too far down that rabbit hole, I think, and they'd rather have him be that role and have it be on the surface level and just something that they can tie into Bajor every now and then. And they're not particularly interested in exploring. As you say, they do get into this further down the line to mixed reviews, I guess would be the way, but we'll get there when we get there. But what do you think about Sisko as the writer's understanding of the emissary?
I think the emissary is there to herald the opening of the wormhole and also eventually the destruction of the power wraiths. So he's like the prophet of a new religion, even though the religion isn't new, but he's the Muhammad figure.
Yeah.
It's the more orthodox, it's, Muhammad casting those Al-Lat and the other gods out of the temple in in Mecca, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's the conventional prophet coming along and getting rid of the old autochthonous pantheistic local gods with this more potentially international religion or religiosity. So I think that's what the emissary is about. What I feel is that there is a lack of I'm struggling to express this, but I think there's a lack of teachings that actually impact behavior in the Bajoran religion. So there's a lot of ritual stuff. There's going to the Bajoran temple and
Wearing the earring.
having these sort of wearing the earring. Well, I think the earring is more of a local custom rather than something specifically religious.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't the earring about family surnames?
Oh, I think
The kind of earring you wear
Yeah.
reflects your family surnames, which is part of an old caste system that they used to have, which comes up in a later episode. When we have, I don't remember the name of this episode, but you remember later in the series, somebody wants to revert to the old Bajoran caste system.
Mm-hmm.
And Kira attempts to go along with this. And her caste was artists, and she has to become a potter, and she makes a horrendous, ham-fisted job of it. Because she's not part of the warrior caste.
Right. Yeah.
The earrings are a kind of throwback to that. But I don't know, how much that is related to the teachings of the religion. So you have to go to the temple and you do a kind of meditation and you have this sort of hallucinogenic experience with the orbs. I think we could see the orbs as a hallucinogen. So it's like taking Impeccatua or something.
Yep.
But what are the actual teachings for your day-to-day? So you have to fast on Haspera. And it's during Haspera that this episode takes place in Haspera. But Haspera seems to be this new festival they've initiated to give thanks for the coming of the emissary. But apart from that, are there any dress codes? Are there any sexual codes? Are there any dietary restrictions? I don't see how the religion impacts on people's lives. And for something that is so central to the country's identity, I think that's a little odd.
Yeah. No, we're never told what a good Bajoran is in the eyes of a Bajoran because they don't really seem to have they have a sort of bland, be good people type thing, it seems to be, but it never really delves into all the religions. All have different guides as to what makes you a good believer in that religion. They're all somewhat similar and they're all somewhat different from each other, and the Bajoran ones are just never fully fleshed out in that regard. And
especially since it's basically a theocracy or a semi-theocracy on Bajor.
Yes, right. So you think it would have very large impacts on how these people actually exist with each other, but we're never really given any of that. So maybe the vagueness of the religion fits into the general vagueness of this episode. But we can push on to the next. There's a couple of the character interactions here. I don't know if you want to talk about Dax, Bashir, Worf O'Brien, or Quark and Hanak. I believe that guy's name is.
Yes, let's talk about Worf, Quark, and I think it's pronounced Hanak.
Yeah, Hanak. Okay, sure.
The Karema tradesman.
Yep.
I would just say one last thing about the Sisko Kira relationship, which is that again, there's so much emphasis here in DS9 on personal relationships that I I feel that on the Enterprise, for example, people's personal relationships, on the Enterprise of Next Generation, people's personal relationships are so muted and professional relationships take so much precedence. And the same is largely true even on Voyager, where they don't know how long they will be in the Delta Quadrant. You know, Janeway has to reluctantly concede that people are going to end up pairing off. And here, it's not just that it's okay to be friends, it's that it's considered a problem that Sisko and Kira are not personal friends outside of work.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
And there are a lot of romances going on DS9. And of course, there's also Dax, who is this very non-judgmental figure who is kind of encouraging people's dating. And Dax and Kira gossiping about dating each morning when they go down to ops. You know, their first 10 minutes of conversation, I think somebody says, is always talking about who is dating whom on the station. And that, I can't imagine that happening on Picard's Enterprise, for example. So I really enjoyed the scenes between Quark and Hennock. And I thought the acting, Armin Shimmerman's acting in this was marvelous. I mean, I do think his acting is beautiful throughout this series. And I like the kind of, I think somebody once described the Quark scenes as the Merchant of Venice in space.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of Quark's character arc is one of the most interesting. And the moments of kind of sympathy and empathy that we feel for Quark are, you know, what some of the more hard-fought moments, because he is such a materialist and a cynic, of course. And I felt that this episode gave us a strong sense of what psychologically motivates the Ferengis in their pursuit of trade. That it's not all about simply making latinum. It's not about the latinum itself. It's about the process, the hunt, the risk. And that kind of excitement came over very clearly in the interactions with Hennock. I think it's also, I'm troubled by the fact that the Federation, despite the things that happen at the end of, I think, season 2 is when Odo kills the changeling.
Yep, end of season 3, actually. Yeah, when he kills the
end of season 3. Yep. Yes, end of the previous season when he kills the changeling, and his last words, the changeling's last words to Odo are, "It's too late. We're everywhere." I felt that really, at the end of that season, it really raised the stakes about the level of danger. And I think that one of the failures in Deep Space Nine in general, and in season 4 in particular, is that they didn't really, that warning of the changelings was not really justified. That we don't really get a very strong sense of the changelings now having infiltrated everything.
Yeah.
I would have liked the sense of peril to have ratcheted way up after that episode, which I thought was a fantastic episode and a really chilling ending to the season. And instead, the Federation seems so unworried that they're even trading with Dominion partners against the Dominion's wishes. That they're going in there not to make latinum, that's Quark's motivation, but just to create some business ties.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand that this is a sort of, even though the Federation don't have money, and I think the economics in DS9 is also very problematic, but even though they don't have money, I can see how free trade goes along with a set of liberal humanist we could even say Enlightenment values, which the Federation embodies or largely embodies, with the exception of things like Section 31. But at the same time, it seems like an extraordinarily rash thing to do.
I think that you're absolutely right. There's two ways you can look at it. You can look at it as, in the terms of it being a TV show, the writer's room is sitting there saying, well, we can't just not go to the Gamma Quadrant. It's like the only place that we have to go to. But on an internal story logic, it makes absolutely zero sense that the Federation continues to go into the wormhole after the Dominion told them that's the one thing that they're not allowed to do. Once they get over there, it doesn't make any sense to me that the Dominion doesn't have a presence on the other side of the wormhole. You'd think that they would lock the door, basically, by putting their version of a Deep Space Nine station on their side of the wormhole.
Yes.
And then the other thing about it is just that if you want to look at the theme of this, it seems to be you could interpret the show saying that the idealism of the Federation has created this naivete where they do not understand what they're dealing with, and that they continue to push against someone who is not going to put up with this, and it's going to come to a head in a couple seasons. But do you think that the Federation's idealism of thinking everyone is kind of like us, we should just go explore places because exploring and learning is good, do you think that's ultimately the downfall here? Do you think it's intentional, or do you think it's just the show needs to go to the Gamma Quadrant to go on an adventure?
I don't know. I prefer the idea that it's intentional.
Yeah.
Because in a sense, it's like a religion for me. I do a lot of cognitive dissonance and I want to justify things that would otherwise not make sense. Star Trek is like a religion for me in that sense. So I prefer your explanation. I'm going to go with your explanation.
I think it works better. It's certainly a better way to look at it. I don't know if they intended, but I do think that I feel it also has sort of modern tie-ins there, where it's the kind of belief that you're doing the right thing and that this is a good idea is going to work out for you in the long run. And it comes to a head with the Dominion. It's the clash of liberalism against the fascism of the Dominion. And it's just that the liberalism doesn't really understand that there are people out there who think like fascists. And, as you say, them going through, they're dealing directly with a member race of the Dominion here. And to me, I think they're called the Karema or something like that. The Karema are... The Karema
yes.
don't make a lot of sense to me, because if they're subjugated members of the Dominion, they should have more of a fear of the Dominion. And they're also portrayed as not quite being Ferengi-like in their seeking of profit. So they don't have, to me, a good driving reason to be risking all of this. And
Hanuk becomes more Ferengi-like, of course, by the end.
Yes, through Quark's influence.
He is through Quark, yes.
But it doesn't seem to be... Do you think he's lying? Or to me, it doesn't seem like that's an innate part of the species. So the risk-taking that they're undertaking here by talking to the Federation doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because their whole view on trading is kind of funny. It's just like we set a fair price and we sell it, and we just kind of exist in this happy free market type world. And the Ferengi shake him out of this. And you could say that the Ferengi outtake is actually a worse, more negative outlook on economics than the Karema have at this point. It would be healthier if the universe had a Karema trade agreement.
I think a Karema trade agreement would be impossible.
Yeah.
I don't know much about economics. I really don't want to get into it too much. But I feel one of the weaknesses in Trek is the kind of lack of capitalism. I think there's one episode where Nog and Jake are talking, and Jake wants to... I can't remember what it is that Jake wants to do, actually, but he needs money for it. And he's talking to Nog, and Nog disapproves, and Jake says, well, can't you lend me some latinum? And Nog says, more fool you for not having any latinum to begin with.
Yes. I'm
sorry that I can't remember exactly which episode that is, but I agree with Nog there. It's a very lovely idea that we could do without money and just have a sort of surplus. But I can't see how that would work psychologically or socially. I just can't envisage that working.
I mean, the problem with the Ferengi is that the sort of easy criticism is that they're capitalists gone mad. They aren't really capitalists, and this episode hones in on that a little bit. They're not purely. It has nothing to do with ownership. I think there's only a handful of episodes where they reference like labor, wages, and stuff like that. It's more. They're more mercantile. They're into the sort of wheeling and dealing aspect of trade. They're kind of.
Oh, no, but there's all this stuff with Rom, when Rom organizes the workers in Quark's bar into a union.
That's later, yes. But to this point in the series, the Ferengi have not really... They do eventually start going into that, but they don't do that at this point. They're more of a wheeling and dealing, as they say here. They're in it for the thrill of the deal. And the thing about it is that you run in at this point in the series, you run into this weird schism where the Ferengi exist in this non-currencied Federation world, and you wonder how that actually works. Like, how are Federation people paying for drinks at Quark's bar? How is any of this arrangement working out for Quark? And you're right that they do get more into a sort of the Union is a good example, Rom's Union, but they don't do that here. And I think that the way that this storyline works out is, I actually don't think it's all that favorable to Quark. I don't really know what the point of this story is besides fleshing out Quark a little bit, but he comes across as sensible, but it doesn't feel like the plot really needed to happen. It felt like they just kind of stuck this on at the end, and I don't really feel it pushed Quark anywhere interesting that I felt he needed to go. The Karema don't make a lot of sense to me. The torpedo allows for a little bit of humor every now and then, but I was a little let down by the storyline.
Yeah, I actually love the torpedo scenes, and I thought Quark was just delightful in this episode. Even though the storyline dialogue are a little weak, but I felt that Quark's character and also Shimmerman's acting were both a delight in this particular episode. I mean, the thing that bothers me more about the Ferengi is that supposedly their main aim is maximizing profit, and yet they keep their women literally naked in the kitchen.
Yep.
And like some kind of theocratic society. So that doesn't make economic sense to me. Half of their workforce is economically unproductive.
Right. And that's they are confusingly, they're basically drawn to bring out the ugliest sides of humanity. And they end up with a culture that doesn't make a lot of sense especially for a culture that we'd run into so frequently. They don't really feel like they could exist as a real society. One of the things that DS9 has done really well is that they fleshed out the cultures a bit. And you can see how the Cardassians exist as a society. You can see how this sort of fascist, like Big Brother state would actually function, and all the characters in it feel realistic. Ferengi society feels like a joke the entire time. It's not a real thing that could actually be productive or end up going anywhere.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think it makes for some very interesting conundrums. I particularly loved Leto and Rom's marriage.
Yep.
That there's a wonderful parallel there. There's a kind of reverse parallel, which is Rom trying to behave like the kind of macho Ferengi male that he thinks he should be, that other people have convinced him he should be, but which is not really in his nature. And that almost fucking up their relationship. Sorry, am I allowed to say the F word?
Yeah, you can drop as many fucks as you want.
Okay. I may let fly some fucks then. I thought that was a wonderful episode, and it was also showed that it was not specifically about the nakedness, because Lita doesn't want to have to be naked at her own wedding. She wants to be dressed, and that's her kind of feminist statement. Whereas when in a later episode, Waxana Troy, is about to marry this very conservative dude. Again, I don't remember which episode this is.
That's a lot of episodes. I think that's even on TNG.
Well, yeah. I mean, Roxana Troy is always trying to get together with one or other person. And I'm afraid my friends often tell me that she reminds them of me. I was hoping for more flattering comparison, but but on that particular episode of DS9, Roxana is engaged to this guy who is a real stick in the mud. And she feels it's her last sort of chance at happiness and love, so she's willing to go along with it, even though he's incredibly conservative, narrow-minded, has absolutely no sense of humor, no sense of fun, and is very rigid about everything. And he wants her to get married according to his tradition, which involves wearing some elaborate wedding dress. And she, of course, wants to go naked at her wedding because that's the Betazoid way. And so she turns up at her wedding completely naked. Once she's decided that she can't be with this guy if he is such a conservative asshole, she turns up at the wedding completely naked. And of course, he is totally shocked, and she is saved by that from a relationship with him. So there's a lovely reverse parallel there between later wanting to be dressed for her own wedding and Roxana Troy wanting to be naked for her wedding.
Yeah, freedom of choice for those characters. Yeah. It's the show frequently is pushing against because the societies are all different from each other. You'll have characters who have different opinions just to push against those societies. So there'll be a great sort of mixing of ideas and stuff about what people want to do for their weddings. In your example, if they want to go dressed or not. One of the strengths there is that the culture building of DS9 has been pretty exceptional to that point, and it's just it feels very much like TNG-ish when you bring in a race like the Karema, who feel very flimsy to me. And Cromwell's performance here is great. Shimmerman and Cromwell both do a fantastic job with what they're given. It's just it's a lot of.
The eyes on Quark, his eyes.
Yeah, he's very good. The problem really is just that I think my criticism extends to all of the stories. It's just that they don't have enough time to get across what they're trying to say here. I don't really know what Quark is trying to say. He's trying to say that wheeling and dealing is good. Maybe you should take some risks. If that's the takeaway, life is better if you take a few risks and you don't go all buttoned up.
That's the takeaway, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
But there's no excitement without risk.
Yes.
And you don't value something unless you have taken risks to get it. And I can see the validity of that completely. And I also love the way he just pulled out the thing, the firing device.
Although I'm surprised the Jem'Hadar buy torpedoes. That seems a little bit crazy to me. You think they'd I don't know. That just seems odd that they buy them from a race. I guess that makes sense within the context of the Dominion. It just felt a little bit funny.
Yeah. I mean, it made perfect sense to me because the Kremer are their subject people. Why don't they? Well, they obviously do have a monetary system in the Delta Quadrant, but the Gamma Quadrant. But if we get into economics, I think it's going to make my head hurt.
Well, but I guess
I have enough trouble with Earth economics.
The Dominion apparently will conquer you, but they'll still pay you for your goods, which is an interesting thing. They do have the Dominion are interesting, and they'll show this more in the later seasons, but the Dominion are not a purely brute force conquering thing. They are there at the back end. They are sort of the very incredibly authoritarian state that's taking control, but they sign a lot of agreements with their subjugated races. Like there's a lot of paperwork going between people, which is funny.
Yeah. They have overemployment
exactly.
among changelings. And
the numbers are going up, 4.2%.
Yes. Should
let's
we move on to Dax and oh yes, great minds.
Sure. Well, do you want to do Dax and Bashir or Orphan? I think Orphan
Yes.
O'Brien is a little bit meatier, but if you want to get Dax out of the way first, that might make sense.
I'd like to do Dax and Bashir.
Sure, go ahead.
So I seem to be the only person ever to have viewed the franchise and not have found Bashir creepy.
You didn't find him creepy.
I didn't, no. Okay. I mean, I think that the closest their relationship gets to being creepy is in the Dax episode. I think that episode is called Dax, where she is, where Dax, not Jadzia, but Dax, the symbiont, is accused of murder.
Yes, that is Dax in season 1.
And I don't remember on which planet, but it turns out that people come to abduct Jadzia, to abduct Dax, to take Dax back to stand trial on this planet. And Julian has just been flirting with Dax beforehand at Quark's, and Dax tells him, and he says, shall we go back to my quarters, or something really corny, as he always does. And Dax says, no, I'm going back to bed now. And he says, can I walk you to your quarters or something? She says, that's not necessary. And he's sitting there and he says, she didn't explicitly tell me I was forbidden to follow her back to her quarters. And so he walks along after her, keeping his distance. And as a result, he's able to intercept, or he at least detects. He doesn't intercept, but he witnesses her being abducted. And I feel as though I can see how that might seem creepy if you didn't know who Bashir was, and you don't have faith in his trustworthiness as a person. That would be very creepy if a stranger did that, or someone who you have just a brief acquaintance with. But I felt as if even then we had enough of a sense that Bashir is no rapist, and probably knows where her quarters are anyway, because they're officers on a military station. I think that I didn't find it creepy. Yeah.
Well, Bashir, Bashir is interesting. I feel that there's a modernization of his perspective that kind of makes sense on one hand, kind of doesn't. I agree with you. In my opinion, Bashir is the most TNG-ish of the characters on the show at this point, especially early in his first couple seasons. He is the character who is the sort of do-gooder, optimist, going to go on and take the bull by the horns character who fits very much into the TNG mold of a hard worker, blah, blah, blah. He's kind of pure of heart, and he doesn't really have any compromising issues. They wrote him that way, sort of overly flirty and overly sex-driven. And I think it was really just to give him a character at that point. Like, they didn't know what to do with him. And his episodes that focus on him to that point are terrible. And
I guess I disagree. I thought they wrote him as flirty, and I mean, all of his interactions are flirtations, basically, including, I mean, especially the ones with men. His interactions, these kind of mildly homoerotic interactions that he has with Miles, and in particular with Garrick.
Yeah.
And so he comes across to me like an Argentine man. This would be sort of norm for, I'm Argentine, and this would be much more of a norm in Argentine culture.
Yeah, I think the cliche over here would be Italian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
And, like most cliches, there's a lot of truth in it. And I find it I find it really harmless and fun. And I also enjoy his sort of emotional permeability, his ability to get enthused by people. I find that actually very relatable and lovable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that is when I say the modernization thing, I think the criticism now has come around to, or has turned into more of a inappropriateness. And I would agree with you that I get a little tired early on of him just because of the one note nature of his personality is being that way. He's not given a lot to work with. And well, I don't think he's particularly offensive because he fits into that TNG mold where you're saying you're aware he's not a rapist. It's clear this is not a guy who's going to do anything about this. It comes across a little bit one note.
Right, and Dax would know that too. I mean, if Dax turned around and saw him following her, she'd just be like, "Oh, Julian, come off it."
Right.
You know, she wouldn't be afraid, would she?
No.
For lots of reasons. I mean, for one thing, I think physically she could defend herself, frankly. But also, you know, she knows him. He's not a person who is going to be physically threatening.
Right. Exactly. And I do like the fact that they've molded him into something else here. Although I'll say that there's a criticism of this episode, and I'll ask your opinion about it, is that the episode somewhat undercuts Jadzia and her relationship to him when there's this sort of dialogue going on about how she liked the chase. And they think that it is a undercutting, and it's the male perspective of the Star Trek writers' room coming through there. And I do think there is something to that argument. There is. The relationships on Star Trek are very young 20-year-old men perspectives on relationships. I was just wondering what your thoughts about that. They turn Dax a little bit here, and it doesn't stick. They don't keep this going forward, but it's a little bit of an interesting realization that maybe she liked the chase. And I was curious about what you thought about that.
Right. You know, I feel that ties in with some things that happen later with Ezri. I think at one point Ezri tells Julian that he was Dax's second choice, that she was kind of considering getting together with him, and then she met and fell in love with Worf. And that didn't ring very true to me. I think that I wasn't convinced by that kind of, that she actively enjoyed his sort of chasing of her. But I think she also didn't hate it. It was just mildly annoying at times and sometimes amusing.
Yeah.
But I don't feel she probably had strong feelings about it either way.
I feel early on it's portrayed more as she is playing with Julian because she finds it funny that she can sort of manipulate him that way. And being a creature that's lived for 8 lifetimes or whatever, she has a perspective on, she's fully aware of what's going on, and she's just having a little bit of fun with him.
Yeah, exactly. I felt that too, and not in any cruel way, because he also realizes that that's what she's doing. You know, it's a kind of mutually agreed upon game.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have said that the fantasy that Julian confesses to here when they're in the turbo lift, it's a turbo lift, right, where they're sealed.
Is it? I thought it was just some kind of safe room. It might be a turbo lift, yeah.
Maybe a safe room, yeah. But the little room that they're sealed in, where they're running out of air, and he says that he had this fantasy that this would happen to them alone on a shuttle. And of course, he would save the day and receive her eternal gratitude. And a lot of people thought that was felt that was creepy. Or many people have commented that they felt that was creepy. But I thought that was just a very standard and kind of understandable fantasy.
Yeah.
To have. And I thought it was sort of sweet that he related it.
You know why I think it's creepy? It comes across as creepy, I think, because they are at threat of dying. Like, that is ostensibly what's happening. They're in a very life or death thing, and he is revealing his innermost thoughts at this point because he believes he might die. The problem is the pacing of the episode. He admits to it so quickly that it feels like he was just waiting for a moment to be locked in a room with her to tell her about this. And it doesn't come across as they've spent 40 minutes together slowly realizing that they're dying. And before they draw their last breath, he admits this to her, and then they're saved. That would be the other episode that you do this in.
Right. Yeah. So it's a little glib.
Right.
It should come a little later, and we have to sort of suspend our disbelief about the amount of time they're in there versus the amount of screen time that we see.
Yes, that's exactly right. That would be the only reason that I would have a problem with it. I mean, and the Dax thing is, I don't feel it's undercutting. I don't feel it's weird for Dax to be saying that. It doesn't quite jive with the early portrayal of it, in my opinion. And I feel Dax is never written particularly well because I don't feel like Dax reacts to situations like this as someone who has lived 8 lifetimes and has 8 lifetimes worth of experience to deal with stuff.
I mean, I think I do feel that, actually. I mean, here there was something slightly kind of childish about her response, which I think could have been more knowing, more arch, more kind of jokey and fun, which is how she normally responds to things, which I think is a very mature way of responding. And it feels more immature at this moment. And it feels, when I was watching this episode, I was remembering an episode of Voyager with Tom Paris, who I do think is the most annoying character in all of the Trek franchises. If there were one character I could just get rid of, it would be this all-American kind of
blonde-haired, blue-eyed
golden boy. Yeah, golden boy dude. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being blonde-haired, blue-eyed American or whatever.
That's me. That's you're describing me.
Sounds lovely. He's so wholesome, he's too wholesome. And, but you remember the episode when he and B'Elanna, I think their shuttlecraft explodes. Of course, my poor memory, I don't remember what this episode is called, but their shuttlecraft explodes and they end up in their spacesuits, floating in space.
Right, yep.
Alone, and the air is running out in their suits. And of course, one of them they up the stakes by giving one of them a leak in their suit, so they have to share their air. And B'Elanna tells Tom that she loves him. And then the next day, I think for a few days, she completely avoids him after this confession. And then finally, Tom manages to get her alone in a turbo lift, and she immediately says, "You should just forget what I said when our air was running out." Mm-hmm. And he says, "You didn't mean it then?" She says, "Oh yes, I meant it, but you don't have to be." She doesn't put it like this, but the idea is you don't have to be bound by something someone said to you at the moment when they thought you were both dying.
Yes.
How you responded to that, I'm not going to hold you to that because of the specifics of that situation. I think that gave a kind of interesting take on this sort of romantic situation, let's say.
Yeah, it's in the judicial system. It's an example of the jury being told to disregard what someone has just said. Kind of, it's like you're not supposed to pay attention to this thing because it wasn't supposed to be said. So just kind of ignore that as best you can, which is maybe
of course. And of course, you cannot disregard.
Right?
How can you possibly disregard?
You just delete that file, unfortunately, or the log.
Yes. I think also there's a little bit of unintentional, because I think Terry Farrell didn't decide until much later to leave the series. But there's a little bit of kind of foreshadowing of the Ezri and Bashir relationship, because that little door is just left ajar for a future relationship between Bashir and Jadzia. And I think that might be part of what's going on there with Jadzia's response, that the writers didn't want to eliminate that possibility.
Yeah.
In case later they wanted to create that romance. And of course, in the end, they do kind of create a romance between Bashir and Dax.
Yes. Yeah.
which some people also find very troubling.
I find the concept of Dax I find a little bit troubling, but I've ranted about that to the point where people are now complaining, so I'm not going to go into it. But I think that I agree that it's probably a writer decision to keep their options open. You need to do this too. Just further down the line, who knows what's going to happen? Let's keep things available between these two. I don't really have a problem with that. I think that those two are actually very comfortable actors with each other at this point, and their scenes generally work with each other. They are.
Yeah, they have a lot of chemistry.
They do, yeah.
The actors, yeah.
And Siddig, the actor who plays Bashir, has come a long way in just his own comfort level with the role. I think he feels much more natural on the station and in his scenes at this point. And the one criticism of the storyline for these two is that the original concept of this episode was that the Defiant would crash on a planet and go into its oceans, and so it was actually a submarine episode.
Yes.
So the danger. This scene would have played out exactly the same, except the danger was that water had breached the hull. So instead of gas, there was water chasing after them. And I will say that it being gas versus not being water, gas does not feel the same level of terror that water does, I think, as a human being. Like, watching water pouring in at you is much more terrifying than the gas. And I think that the setup of the episode actually suffers when they changed it to a gas danger as opposed to a water danger.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're so used to seeing people rushing out of gas-filled rooms or rushing back into gas-filled rooms to rescue people that I've got quite blasé about poisonous gases.
Right.
I think at one point she says it's fluorine, or he describes it as fluorine gas. So it's pretty nasty stuff. But she just has a little slight frog in her throat.
Yes.
She seems fine. And, it's a nice opportunity to do a little cuddling.
Yeah.
I don't guilt-free snuggles. So I can't, it lacks, there's a lack of a sense of urgency, which I think some other moments in the episode do have. I love I enjoyed the kind of fight scenes, the outdoor scenes when we were watching the Defiant. The scene where the Defiant is being repeatedly hit and they're waiting to see whether their torpedo will actually target the Jem'Hadar ship or turn back and target the Defiant itself. I think that's lovely. But these scenes actually on board didn't give me the same sense of peril.
Yes. And I think that's its greatest failing as a disaster episode. I think if you're doing a disaster episode, you really need to get this sense of peril across. And I feel that TNG's disaster episode did that really well. This is a DS9 version of disaster, I would argue, where instead of in the TNG episode, the characters are paired off and they all have a technical problem they need to solve. They all, like Riker and Data, have to go turn off the electricity. Picard has to get out of the shuttlecraft. Geordi and Beverly have to get rid of those radioactive barrels. And that's a very TNG story, that these characters, the characters are archetype blank slates, and we're going to put them into something that technically needs to be solved. DS9 doesn't do that. It does, here's a problem. We've paired off all the characters. Now the characters are going to share a scene with each other. And
it's about exploring their personal relationships, whereas in the Enterprise, it's this well-honed technical team.
Right. And
personal relationships are really secondary. In DS9, people are all exploring their friendships and even their love affairs. And, the captain's son is trying to matchmake him, whereas Picard has the one relationship with a flute-playing
she plays keyboards.
Woman.
Yeah, she plays keyboards in their band.
She plays keyboards, and he plays a kind of recorder type instrument.
Yeah.
Which he's learned in an alternative universe when he was on that planet where the alternative Picard grew old.
Yep, Inner Light.
And he briefly has a girlfriend, this female officer who plays keyboards while he plays flute. And she's sent on one single mission where she's endangered, and he decides that he has to break it off because he's too emotionally overwrought by her being in danger.
Yes. Yep.
That stops him from being able to focus on his job. And, there are so many frustrating and frustrated relationships in TNG. There's Picard and Beverly, and there's at one point Troy and Worf in this alternative timeline.
Yep.
And of course there's Troy and Riker, who are sort of on a break, I guess we could describe it. But she is like hanging on, waiting to see what happens. And Beverly is also kind of hanging on, waiting to see what happens. And that doesn't happen in Deep Space Nine, and I'm really happy it doesn't happen. It feels more psychologically healthy, and I think it's not conceivable within the world of DS9. People seem to just embark on the relationships that they want to have without worrying about the professional or other implications, or not worrying so much that it stops them from seeking love.
Yeah, there's a Cisco with Cassidy has a professional sort of responsibility, but it doesn't ultimately hold up his relationship with her. He's concerned about her being on the ship and like what Starfleet means to be, to be involved with Starfleet and stuff like that. But they do pursue each other's relationships freely in a way that TNG didn't.
Yes, I mean, at one point, I think she's breaking regulations, and he needs to. There's a little bit of a conflict between his professional duties to reprimand her and his personal relationship with her, but still, there's never the thought that therefore they can't have a personal relationship.
Right. Yep. Do we want to?
And Kira is. Yeah.
Oh, no,
sorry. Let's
go
move
ahead.
on to. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Orphan O'Brien. Yeah, we'll talk about the action-packed episode segment that is Orphan O'Brien, which is, to me, I'm glad we save it to the last, because to me it is it's just the alpha example of why a lot of the storylines here to me feel incomplete, which is because there is no narrative drive to this segment of what's going on here. It's just Worf has difficulty telling his subordinates what to do. O'Brien tells him how to fix that. Worf immediately changes how he deals with his subordinates, and everything works out. There's very little conflict in this thing for Worf. It's ostensibly a learning experience for Worf, but he doesn't have a moment of pushing against change. He is just him. And then he's told to change. He immediately changes, and everything works out okay for him.
Right. I mean, that might also have to do with the brevity of each of these little vignettes. I think there's an episode of Voyager in which this whole scenario is fleshed out in much more depth. When Tuvok is training some of the Bajorans who are on board Voyager, who the former Maquis crew members. I think there's a Bolian and a Bajoran woman, and a couple of other crew members who are recalcitrant and underachievers and who just can't get with the program on the ship.
Yep.
And Tuvok is trying to appeal to them, has created this, it's about pedagogy basically, that Tuvok has created this program with great logic and care on his part to try to rehabilitate them or try to improve their performance, and they just respond really badly. And in the end, he has to discover a better way of appealing to their psychology.
Yes.
And that's really tough for him as a Vulcan. Very tough. And I think we are expected to read the same kind of psychology into this, that there are a lot of things that are very tough for Worf, both as a Klingon and also as a kind of... Worf is a Klingon who grew up with humans, and he seems to be a teetotaler. He's always drinking his prune juice instead of blood wine. And he's also the only Klingon in Starfleet. So he has this somewhat embattled relationship with his identity as a Klingon. Rather like, I feel there are parallels between him and some of the kind of hyphenated Americans who are really, really concerned about losing their parents' culture.
Yeah.
I'm thinking particularly of Indian Americans because that's the group that I know, because I'm half Indian. But this happens in many other cases as well. That Worf is also in this position, and he's very, he's kind of both wanting to authentically connect with that culture and also to a certain degree play acting it. Trying to make himself the perfect Klingon warrior. So I think we're not really given enough in the episode to come to this conclusion, but it's the way that I'm watching the episode is with that in mind. But it's not well illustrated. We don't get a sense of this being difficult for him, and it should be difficult.
Yeah, I
also,
almost
he has no sense of humor, which is a real handicap for him.
That's I mean, the thing is that he is, so the usual thing is that Worf is usually battling against his Klingon heritage. And here they've actually changed it where he is a fish out of water again, except not in terms of Klingon. He's in terms of being a commanding officer who, because he's made a switch from his yellow uniform to his red, he's now in charge of people and he gets to order people around. Well, he's always been in charge of people, but he's in a more streamlined executive command position. And that seems to be the thing here. He's kind of learning how to be a good officer, and maybe not everyone can bend to his rigid understanding of what the rules are. He has that opening scene, which ties in nicely about he's not happy with the performance reviews. And then they bring it into he's dealing with engineers who are not Starfleet officers, apparently. They're just engineers who work on the ship. And
I was quite interested in the fact they're not Starfleet. I mean, there do seem to be an awful lot of people who are involved in kind of military organizations and who are also on the ship who are not Starfleet.
Well, I think
there's Quark, who's very much not, and the engineers, and there's also Kira, who sort of both is and isn't.
Well, I'd say that
they
are Starfleet, but they're not officers. So they don't have rank the way that the other characters do. They're like O'Brien. O'Brien doesn't have a rank. He can't order anybody around, but he is a member of Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
So
right. They
it's
haven't
more
been
like
to Starfleet Academy. That's what O'Brien says, actually. He doesn't say they're not Starfleet. He says they haven't been to the Academy.
Yes, and so going to the Academy is the prerequisite to get rank in Starfleet. And then, so these guys just kind of signed up as something to do, I suppose. They don't have any loftier goals or ambition than to be ordered around by this guy wearing makeup who comes into their section and tells them what to do. It's
they're
a
nerds,
new,
I mean,
right?
They're geeks, not nerds. Technically, they're geeks.
And this guy, Worf, is coming in and bullying them. And they don't appreciate it, but they do get the job done. But I just think it's an unsatisfying little story. You can tell this story over the course of an episode, but as a little vignette, it is just remarkably dull. I think it doesn't show you anything about Worf.
It doesn't. It is a little bit heartwarming. I really like the engineers, and I think that. There are a lot of very heroic characters on both on the Voyager ship and in TNG, and there are a lot of sort of everyman figures in the DS9 franchise. So I think I like it, and it does help later when we're on the planet when Muñiz is dying. Now, of course, I don't remember exactly which episode that was, but you remember Muñiz is dying in one of the future episodes. And we have to have empathy for him as a character and believe in O'Brien's relationship with him.
Right.
and O'Brien's affection for him. And this does do a little bit of nice paving of the way for that.
I like one thing I do like about the way they started to draw O'Brien is that O'Brien is kind of the blowhard who will tell you like old war stories and no one cares about it, which I think is a funny character beat for him. He has that thing about, well, Ensign, last time Commander Sisko got us out of much worse of a situation than this. And I know, Chief, you told me 500 times already. I like that characterization.
Yeah. It's a very lovable character, the O'Brien character. And the sort of put upon every man. I mean, he does suffer a ridiculous amount in DS9. And I actually feel it's too much. We had so many episodes where he's, he has this evil spirit takes over Keiko's body. He has the episode in which he is in this kind of virtual prison cell and he feels like he's gone through many, I think 20 years or something in the prison cell, and he ends up he ends up killing the other prisoner, but I can't remember exactly what way, because of these memories that have been implanted in him by this dreadful penal system. There are so many moments of O'Brien suffering.
Yeah.
That each time there's a new episode like that, I feel, don't do this to me again.
Yeah.
I can't take any more O'Brien suffering. Make someone else suffer instead.
He's a man of steel will. He is just unbreakable despite everything that the show will throw at poor Chief O'Brien.
Yes, it's a Job. He's a Job character.
Yeah, he is, yeah. Worf is not. Worf is continuing his little breakdown into DS9 systems. All the previous Worf episodes have had to deal with Worf fitting into the new system, and this continues that, except it's in a slightly different way, where he's getting used to being the commanding. I think he's the XO or the Defiant at this point, and that's why they're making this distinction. But their solution is fine. I don't mind anything about that. It's just their storyline is a part of the larger problem I have with it. With that said, we're going to take a break. We're going to play an audio clip. And Iona and myself are going to come back. We're going to give our final thoughts about the episode, and then we'll give it a rating, read some patron thoughts, and then we will call it a day.
Excuse me, sir. Here's the repair schedule we drew up for the Defiant. With your approval, we thought we'd start by tearing out the ODN lines. They're shot. It'd be easier to get to the manifolds that way. And then we figured
Proceed at your own discretion, Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, sir.
How long will the repairs take?
16 hours?
Oh, you can do it in 12.
12. Sure. No problem.
See? You can give him a little slack, but you can't take your hands off the reins.
All right, everybody. So we are here with our final thought segment for Starship Down, which is probably, I'd assume this came out after Black Hawk Down. Maybe it didn't, actually. It might have actually come out first. But I know typically what we do here is we read patron comments. People who support the show on Patreon get to leave their thoughts, and we'll read them out loud and then kind of react to them. What we have here it is. Sorry, I forgot to highlight these. So we are looking for Starship Down. Cut out all this silence. Starship Down. Stephen Cobb says, David Mack was one of the writers of this episode and a Star Trek book author. He's written some really, really good post-Nemesis books that feature DS9 characters. Iona, do you read any of the Star Trek books? Are you familiar with any of them?
I haven't. I haven't read them. In an ideal universe, I would like to also read them all.
Right. I actually don't like. I don't like tie-in literature to shows like this. I've tried to read a couple of them, and I don't like them particularly. And I don't know what it is, whether it's my sense of canon being ruined. I don't consider them to be real Star Trek episodes, so I don't want to be watered down with them on some level. But I have a hard time getting through those kind of books, even though I've tried. Kyle Barrett says, I'll leave the examination of the actual episode down to you professionals, but I will say that the title Starship Down is perfect.
Professionals, I like that.
It's perfect and wonderfully captures the pulpy submarine thriller vibe that the episode is emanating. What did you think about that? Did you, if you want to talk a little bit more about your thoughts about like the submarine vibe and the disaster vibe, what was your takeaway about from the episode in that?
I feel there wasn't quite enough of a submarine vibe. That I felt the submarine vibe didn't really come off. For that, I would have liked to have seen through the view screen rather than interference. I would have liked to have seen nothing. Like that episode of Voyager Night, where they're just passing through a completely empty area of space.
Yeah.
One of my favorite episodes, actually. And it felt too much like space as usual for the submarine-y vibe to really kick in for me, and I think that was a weakness. Also, I have to confess that when I hear that title, I can't stop hearing the echoes of Watership Down.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Which is quite irrelevant.
Well, I think of Black Hawk Down. That's the only thing. I think that came out after this, but I can't be sure.
That's more relevant, at least.
Yes, right. Ship under attack and all that.
Yes.
Will Yates says, Starship Down, good World War II submarine piece in space. I thought the bookend on the Dax-Bashir romance was a little ham-fisted. I really liked seeing James Cromwell as an honest businessman juxtaposed against all of Ferengi society. I was a little disappointed that in the end, Quark's greed won out and brought him over to the dark side. The lower camera angles did add to the claustrophobia. The lower camera angle, they do a Dutch angle on Quark where the ship is creaking is probably the most submarine-y shot that they have the entire time. What did you think about Quark's greed winning out?
I liked it. I'm rather pro Quark, I have to say.
Yeah.
I'm a skeptic about this post-capitalist society that they have, even though I love the idea of it. But it feels too much like communism to me, and communism is not a system compatible with human nature.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, they don't really delve into it. They're not particularly... It's one of those things that started off as a...
humanoid nature, I should say.
Yes.
Humanoid nature.
The changelings walk amongst us, remember?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And the translation, of course, the Ferengi translation for humanoid is Ferengioid, Ferenginoid, Cardassianoid, Bajoranoid, etc.
It's that it's whatever that original race in the chase was, that like the race that we all came off of, the very bland looking blank slate race that seeded the galaxy in TNG. Let's see here.
Yep.
Matthew Ross says, Starship Down, this is compared to Balance of Terror. However, I feel this pales in comparison and lacks a sense of tension. The implosion on the ship, I feel, was not done correctly and looks better on Voyager. I think that the closet with Dax and Bashir was a great friend zone that conveniently had full oxygen content. That said, I still think this was a good episode. Just to me, it felt like there was a lack of urgency. James Cromwell adds to the collection of multiple characters in Trek lore, with another character playing here. I like that the bridge had to be abandoned and run from a smaller console in engineering. And Kira's trying to keep Sisko going with the stories and show of faith, although well-intentioned, seemed flat to me, especially with the stilted Bajoran prayer. One thing for sure, the engineers should just shut up. Worf is trying to save their lives and make the icons look pretty. The fact Worf acts like he has never had subordinates before is odd. Maybe it's the real reason he's almost on every TNG away mission and gets his butt kicked. He's tired. But O'Brien with the good old advice is fine. The Ferengi cheat your way to success guide to the trade minister was ridiculous, and the fact that the Ferengi, the known cheats of the universe, are handling a trade of the Federation is equally nutty. But the attempt to take out the torpedo was fun to watch, and I did like Quark's taking a chance. But why would parts not be labeled? That's really odd. Christian Puck says, Starship Down, it's fun to be stuck on a cramped Defiant, both with the pressure of the situation and the literal pressure of the gas giant around them. I like the various characters breaking off into their isolated sections and seeing how they interact. Kira and Sisko are the least interesting to me, but I like the others. Seeing Bashir and Dax interact shows just how far both of them have come along. Quark pulling the plug on the torpedo has always made me laugh. Not amazing, but very solid. And then we have... That's it. That's it for the comments. Thank you, patrons, very much for leaving your comments. Iona, at this point, we give our final thoughts, and then you give a rating. We have a rating scale here, a 1 to 5. So 1 is a terrible episode, a 5 is an all-time classic, and there's gradients in between. So do you want to give your final thoughts about the episode as a whole, and then just give me a rating on 1 to 5?
Yes, so I think the episode as a standalone episode is unexciting and wasn't as much fun to rewatch. To rewatch, especially out of sequence, out of context, as I was imagining. And I feel as though I read way more into the episode than was actually shown, because the episode is so focused on the character relationships, which I think in general are so well done on DS9. And I have so much affection for those characters. Even though my favorite character in the series, Odo, doesn't feature in this, he just has a tiny little role in the end. He chuckles and raises one eyebrow at Quark, so one of his more kind of cliched moments. But still, I have this fondness for the episode, and I think that is based on how it works embedded within the franchise. But as a kind of single episode, it doesn't work so well. So I'm going to rate it with a 2.
Sounds good. I think that it's the weakest episode of the 4th season so far. I do feel it comes across as a little bit of a fan fiction-y episode, in that it was submitted by outside writers and then was rewritten by the room, and there was only so much to do. I think it lost a lot in its translation from a literal submarine episode to a gas episode. It felt to me like it was a DS9ification of a disaster episode, except I would have actually preferred less character stories. I know that they wanted to sort of keep the pace up, but I would have cut 2 of the stories probably and maybe just stuck with 2 of them. I think that the Kira and Cisco storyline would have been one of them, and I probably would have had Quark and Hanak as the lighter storyline going alongside of those 2.
Yes.
And I think pairing those as a sort of A and B story would have really strengthened it, and I would have had the serious nature of Kira and Cisco, and then the goofy, corny nature of Quark and his buddy. And doing that would have allowed them to focus a little bit more, and it wouldn't have come off as so empty and trite in the way that it does by the end of the episode. And I don't think it's bad, but it certainly would have needed a few fixes. And it's not an episode that I think is something I would go back and really focus on or recommend someone watching a curated run through of the series would be. So I'm also going to give it a 2. We came out at the same. This is a 2 for me, is generally an episode that could have been okay if they had made a few changes to it. And I think that one fits nicely into that definition. That's about it. Well, I'm sorry you didn't get a better episode, but thank you very much for coming on to the show to talk about it.
I chose poorly.
Your first choice was Rejoined, which was a very popular one. That one went very early.
Yes.
Rejoined is more of the character stuff.
I hope one day I can come on again and make a better decision.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for coming on. Do you have anything you want to plug, or any Twitter handle that people could find you at?
Yes, so I'm the sub-editor of a magazine. It's called Areo, A-R-E-O, Areo Magazine. And I would encourage you to check that out. And we also have a Patreon. It's completely reader and listener supported, because there is also an accompanying podcast called 2 for Tea, which you can find on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, all the usual podcast platforms. And I do both those things together with my captain, Helen Pluckrose. I'm the first officer on that ship. Mm-hmm. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Iona Italia.
Yeah, you guys had Sarah Hayter on recently.
Yes, our last episode was with Sarah Hayter.
Yep. And I noticed that your comrade in arms, Helen, got the Sam Harris retweet recently, which was very exciting, very interesting.
Yes, someone has also shot a documentary about Helen.
Oh, really?
You can follow her at H Pluckrose. We are actually 2 separate people, although we have never been spotted in the same room at the same time. But I assure you,
you're the first
actually.
Yeah, you're the first guest that we've actually had on. It's just me usually imitating on multiple people and multiple voices, which is the way the podcasts are meant to be, I think. Yeah.
Wow, I'm so honored. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. You can check out Iona's Twitter. You can check out Ario, which is very interesting. It is a fighting the good fight against the bad ideas that seem to be overwhelming the world at some points.
Yes, we try to be a non-partisan liberal humanist magazine.
Yes, it's right in the wheelhouse of my personal politics, I think, is the way to describe it. But it's very good, very well done, great writing. Thank you very much for coming on. And let's see here. So, guys, if you enjoyed the show, you enjoyed the content, first time listening, check out all the social media links. Will be in the video description. You can go to patreon.com/the Pensky File if you want to support the show there. A couple $2 a month. You get extra podcasts. You get extra listening. You get the ability to vote on episodes and stuff that we cover. You can go to Discord. We talk on Discord. It's a good place to be. And then outside of that, I think that's pretty much it. Oh, rate the show on iTunes. You can do it on your phone. It's the easiest way to do it. It's greatly helpful. It's supremely helpful. If you don't want to support the show on Patreon, all I ask is that you take 2 seconds to click your phone podcast app, your iPhone, open it up, and rate the show. Thank you very much, guys, for listening. Iona, again, thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure.
And guys, we will see you next time with, what is the episode after this? It is Little Green Men. So Roswell-themed episode with Quark and company. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.